And welcome to sorry about that, my mute keeps turning back on. And welcome to the second of a two-part series, Developing Local Purchase of Agricultural Conservation Easement Programs, hosted by American Farmland Trust. I am Angie Doucette, AFT's Midwest Farmland Protection Manager, and thank you for taking the next 90 minutes out of your busy schedules to join us today. Before we begin, I'd like to cover some logistics. Everyone has been muted and attendee cameras are off. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can do so by going to the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. The orange arrow at the top of the panel allows the panel to shrink and reopen, and you will see a question section of the control panel. We ask that you please use this section for all of your comments and questions you have for our three panelists that have joined us today. We will allow for plenty of time for questions after each of our speakers. We ask that you reserve the chat function for any technical difficulties. Finally, we are recording this webinar and we will send the link to the recording to everyone who has registered. We ask that you please feel free to share this recording widely within your networks. For those of you that were not with us last week, a little bit about American Farmland Trust. American Farmland Trust is a national nonprofit that was founded in 1980 to save America's farms and ranches. We have national and regional initiatives that not only focus on protecting agricultural land, but also on promoting sustainable agricultural practices and advocating for farmers who work the land both today and in the future. Within our organization, we have the Farmland Information Center, also known as the FIC. I specifically call out the FIC as it is a clearinghouse for information about farmland protection that serves people like yourself working to save farmland for agriculture. The FIC has the nation's largest online collection of print materials, laws, and sample documents related to farmland protection, as well as staff who provide direct technical assistance and answer questions for information via phone or email. So if you actually call this 800 number, you will speak to one of our lovely FIC staff at AFT and they will help you answer your questions. For this webinar, the FIC has compiled resources regarding purchase of agricultural conservation easement programs and local enabling ordinances that you can access via the handout section in your control panel. Now, before I turn things over to the stars of our show, our panelists today, to discuss the components of purchase of agricultural conservation easement programs, I wanted to take a brief moment to recap from last week on exactly what is an agricultural easement and what are PACE programs for those of you that couldn't join us. An agricultural conservation easement is a type of conservation easement, which is a voluntary deed restriction that limits the development that can occur on the land. An agricultural conservation easement is specifically focused on protecting agricultural land for future agricultural use. An ag easement will limit non-farm related development. It may limit how the property can be subdivided. It typically allows for agricultural infrastructure like on-farm energy production and housing for farm labor in some cases. And the point of agricultural conservation easement is to be flexible and recognize that farm operations change and evolve over time. Easements are perpetual, and as it often is said, they run with the land, which means that all future owners of the land must abide by the terms of the easement. Land under easement stays in private ownership, it stays on local tax rolls, and the owner of the land can sell the land to whomever they choose, whenever they choose. Purchase of agricultural conservation easement or PACE programs, often called PDR programs, can be used as a tool to protect farmland. All PACE or PDR programs are essentially the same as far as their basic features. They typically pay property owners for the value of their agricultural conservation easement to keep the land available for agriculture. Again, these programs are voluntary and landowners elect to apply. Within these programs, land remains in private ownership and management, and landowners retain the rights to sell the land and use the land within the terms of the easement. So today, we're going to hear from our panelists about how their programs began and steps they took to build successful purchase of agricultural conservation easement programs. You will see that there's not one way or approach to build a program, but instead relies on the local context of which you're trying to accomplish your goals. My hope is that you learn from these stories and are equipped with some of the tools and resources to begin on your journey to protect agricultural land in your communities. So let's begin. We start with a familiar face for those of you who joined last week. Janice Hill is not only the Farmland Protection Manager of Kane County, Illinois, the state's only local purchase of ag conservation easement program, but also the owner of Acreage 43560 LLC, which is a planning consulting practice supporting local farmers and communities. Janice has 15 years experience in municipal planning, a master's of city of planning, and is an American Institute certified planner. Welcome, Janice. I will flip through your slides for you.
Angie, for working with my slides. A little bit of computer problems for me this morning. Many of the notes and recommendations I have are from my experience in working in local government and specifically as a land use planner. So you'll note that a lot of the work that I'm pointing out are very specifically for professional staff and officials that are considering programs and what we've learned. You know, also land trust sometimes work in this area as well. And we have land trust in Illinois and in Kane County, and we work side by side with them very well. So I just wanted to point that out. Okay. So here's my point of view after working in this area for quite some time. I believe that we should all of our plans should have room for farmland protection in them. And that's even in urban areas as well. I feel that it's that important that we offer land for future farmland protection. Also, as a mutual goal, we have to have areas for redevelopment in the built environment at the same time, and the two can work very well together. And finally, I think we all need to become better experts at learning about soil quality and the potential for improvement of soil quality in all locations of our communities. Okay. Okay, here's my recommendation. If you are a planner, you know, just use the process that we're trained in. If you're not a planner, pair up with one. This process of creating a new program is very similar to the planning process that we use in local government. There's room for strategy, for building goals, and for public involvement. Next slide. Okay, so the largest public funder of all of this work that we're doing in PACE programs is the federal government through their NRCS programs. In the past, they've been called FRPP, FPP, ASAP, AIL, and all these federal acronyms, but they all, their common denominator is farmland protection and the match that they are looking for. So I always recommend, if you're looking at a program, try to make sure that you know your community from these points of view, these goals, and make sure that whatever strategy and whatever program you're creating addresses these, because you want to make yourself eligible for using these funds. Maybe you don't use them at the beginning. We didn't. We waited for about a year before we started our participation. But certainly you want to make sure that you really understand your soils, you understand where you have these prime, unique, and statewide soils that are of statewide importance, other resources that are important, historical, archaeological, and know your state policies as well. You might need to create some local policies as well. Next slide. Okay, here's what we learned in Kane County, and I really wish we had done this at the beginning of our process, which we didn't. We did this just a few years ago, and this was using county assessors' information. If you're a planner, you know we often do existing land use maps, and those are fine, you know, but they take a lot of time. A lot of field work sometimes to check things out. Here's a quick way for our mappers to find out where you have existing land use, existing agricultural land use, just by the county assessor's data. And of course, this will probably not necessarily line up with your underlying zoning and your planned land use. But it's important to know where you have ag parcels. And you can see in our county, we use our land use strategy that divides the county into 3 corridors. And to your right is our urban corridor, the center is our critical growth, and to our west and our western townships, our ag corridor. So you can see we were very surprised at the amount of agriculture that we had in our urban area. And so that drove us to create our complementary program, Growing for Cane. Once you have this data, you can go ahead and do some mapping and compare this with some of the categories I'm showing you on the right. There's a whole lot of ways to look at what's going on in your community and start to build policies toward your program and what becomes important. Okay, next slide. You know, at a minimum, you want to look at your existing land use, the map that I just showed you, your zoning, layer that on, and then your future proposed land use. Find out what's in alignment, out of alignment. If you're county government like I am, what's happening in your municipality, some of those shared areas in the planning jurisdiction. Find out what's going on there. I think that's a great base for creating a program. Next slide. Another thing that's really important, and you will be asked this question when you create a program to participate in NRCS's program, is the trend of development and what's been happening in your area. So you want to look at land conversion patterns, and this is when your GIS mappers come in very handy. You can look at what's been happening in terms of land conversion and agricultural land loss. Of course, AFT has done some great work on this, but you can kind of drill down to the next layer. Here's some of the other signs that you have some significant changes. Your ag infrastructure lost. Mapping your ag infrastructure is one of the requirements on your NRCS application. So it's helpful to know kind of to get a feel. In Kane County, we noticed during the height of the suburban sprawl that many of our farms had transitioned from row crops to horticulture to deal with the new residential construction. So, you know, that supplying that market though ended up creating a loss in our row crops. So these are signs along with utility extensions. We had a new incorporation. These were signs that we knew that we needed to address our land use loss. And of course, we also have, in addition to AFT's deep resources, we also have, from the planning point of view, our own American Planning Association that looks at the connections of health, food, and farmland protection. Okay, next slide. So I'm a firm believer in listening before creating policy. I know that sometimes as planners, we think that we can know, or elected officials, we know what's best for our community. And oftentimes we do, but I feel that, you know, listening sessions are the first and most important thing you can do in creating a program. Every time that I talk with someone, I find something new out, and it ends up tweaking the program sometimes in terms of by just finding out what's happening with farmers. And you can do this, of course, now online, in person, but these listening sessions, just to find out, even before you propose a farmland protection ordinance or program, find out what's happening in the community. I feel it can really help shape your program. Next slide. And of course, here's the tip that AFT gave us. It's actually a formal recommendation when we created our program, is to create a focus group. And these were the key people that were in our focus group. We had County Farm Bureau representative, we had an elected official who ended up being a champion of our program over 20 years, Plan Commission members, Water District, and of course local farmers. This core group ended up becoming our Farmland Protection Commission. But they really did the deep dive into the work to create the ordinance. Next slide. And so here's some things that once you have done all this work that I talked about and you have this focus group, here's the question I would ask for the focus group, and then ultimately whoever's making your decision. In our case, it was the county board. You've talked about this value of agriculture, which is shown in that light green, and you talk about the market value, and that's the part that's going to be sold, donated, and ultimately extinguished. The question for that group, I would say, is there any reason not to offer this opportunity to landowners? It's voluntary. And so is there some reason you would not want to, or we would want to prohibit participation in that way? Is there some reason you would not want to protect farmland and all of these benefits? And is there some reason you wouldn't want to capture even donated easements? Because there are those people that will do this for a donation. And ultimately, is there some reason you would want to turn away that federal match now and in the future? And if you can get through those questions, I think you can have a program, because there aren't very many people that are going to stand up and say, no, I don't want that for someone else. They may not understand the mechanics, or there may be some fear, but I think at this point in time in your process, these are good questions to ask. Okay, next slide. But I will say, I used this slide the last time too, there's this process for creating the ordinance and then for participants. And many people stay in that learning space for quite a while, and that's okay. But eventually, you're going to take it to your attorney on staff, or your state's attorney in our case, to say, okay, how are we going to do this? Same thing, same process that happens with a participant of the program. There's just eventually a process that you go through, and then eventually there's a time to act. And of course, I think that once you go through the process, you really should move to that stage of action. Otherwise, it just hangs in limbo. And I do know communities where they've just stayed kind of in that process for years and years. They'll learn to think. Next slide. Of course, and why does that happen? Because, many of you have probably seen this kind of behavior slide, the human condition that we're all in. There are some people that are right up at the top that are the innovators, ready to go, let's do it. And, they'll adjust later if there anything that needs refinement. And then you have the people that, come in the middle, and then you have the ones that, maybe never create a program. But I still think it's worth moving into it. Try to become, at more on the innovator and early adopter side of the curve than, a community that never gets in. Next slide. So many people say, like, what happens after you have your ordinance? How do you get the word out? If you've used your process with all of those participants, the word will already be out. I had very little marketing material. I still have very little marketing material because the word is out on the street, and I think that's the best way to do it. You would rather have farmers tell each other about the program than to have to sort of drum up business if you have used this. And this is exactly what happened after our first closing. The word was out within all of our participants, and then the phone calls started to come in. Next slide. And of course, there's always this funding question. Everybody has this, even participants in a program that's existing. How is this funded? What about the money? And so it's the chicken and egg question when you're creating a program. Next slide. But here's what I have to say. Now, AFT can advise me if they know of something else, but I don't know any programs where someone says, here's $5 million, now go create a program. Go create policies, go do the analysis. It's usually the other way around. You have to give people a reason to invest. If you just ask them to invest in nothing, then you probably won't get funding. If you start the process, you develop the list of participants, the money will come. Okay, I think we're getting to the end. Yep, so there's my contact information. I look forward to more questions, and I certainly look forward to my colleagues' presentations about their programs. A lot to learn.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Janice. As always, it's really great to hear your expertise and your experience in developing your program at King County. We are waiting for questions to come in. Maybe people are still thinking, but one first question that we have is how, since you talked about farmer, the communication and not needing to develop many communication materials because farmers talk amongst themselves, and then the interest kind of came at you and people were asking to be participating in the program. A question is, how is the program structured to ensure that land is that the land protected is contributing to long-term environment for agriculture? And in addition to that, what are some of the considerations in determining which of those properties or applicants to prioritize in Kane County?
Sure. Okay, so let me just go back to the first portion of the comment about, remember, if you're working with your soil and water district or your farm bureau, all of these people in your development process, you're communicating at that point. The farm community is there, and those are usually the active people within the farm community. So you've already built up interest there. So and certainly information. I did a lot of presentations at that stage of the process, a lot of discussions. What would this look like? Because you're in that mode of community input processing. That is also the time when we decided to talk about what our ranking, if you want to call it that, process would be when the applications came in. That was one of the big questions. And you remember that we were looking to match NRCS farmland protection programs requirements at a minimum. And that's a requirement now. Every time you submit an application for a parcel for review and funding by NRCS, you have to meet those criteria. So those are the obvious ones. I have to say that one of the recommendations that our board had that I'm really pleased with, we've never denied anyone. That doesn't mean we fund everyone. We don't deny any application, and that's because it seems very kind of like government review if you're denying something, but also some applicants came in with projects that didn't necessarily meet the federal requirements, but we still wanted to protect them, and so we ended up creating amendments to our ordinance and side programs to address those issues. So that's the first recommendation I would have. We also developed, you'll see many programs that have point system. We were overwhelmed with that at the beginning, and we decided to create qualitative review of applications that would help prioritize them, but not deny anyone, and also address the standards, if you want to call them that, in the NRCS programs and within our own local goals, because you remember you've gone through all that mapping and you might have priorities, but we wanted to do that qualitative review, so my staff reports address that in the same way a planning staff review would, not a ranking of if you only reach 80 points, then you're not in, or you're in or you're out or something like that. And that's proven to be very helpful because remember, it's a voluntary program. You can't decide who's going to come to the table first, second, third.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Janice. I expect we'll have more questions come in as we continue throughout the presentations. We now are going to turn over the presentation to Renee, our next panelist. Renee Lauber of Lauber Consulting, who joins us from Wisconsin. It has over 25 years of experience working on public policy, progressive land use issues, and strategic communications. Renee has worked at the federal level in Washington, D.C., and at the state and local level across Wisconsin. She has served on county planning and farmland protection committees and commissions and land trust boards. She is the executive director of the Dane County Towns Association and a town government consultant. Renee holds a bachelor's in political science and a master's degree in water resource management with a concentration in urban and regional planning. Thanks for joining us here today, Renee.
Okay. I hope everybody can hear me.
We can hear you.
You can hear me. Okay, good. Well, thank you, Angie. It's all the technology. So Angie asked me to talk about the town of Dunkirk's program and how they got started. And just to give you a little bit more background, I think I need to push this button here. I ran the purchase of development rights program in the 90s for about 10 years for the town of Dunn in Wisconsin. And so when I started working with Dunkirk, I knew quite a bit about conservation easements and purchase of development rights programs, or PDR, but I didn't know about getting started. So some of this was new for me, and some of it was kind of old hat. So I'm going to tell you about the town of Dunkirk's story. Dunkirk is in the state of Wisconsin, south central. The middle of the state, or middle of the county, Dane County, has the city of Madison in it. So we are the fastest growing county in the state of Wisconsin, and Dunkirk itself is just south of the city of Stoughton that is growing. Dunkirk is rural. This is the 2018 population. It hasn't changed too much to date. It's a little bit over 2,000 in residents, and it has the beautiful Yahara River flowing through it. So that is Dunkirk. And as part of their story, I think how their program got started is kind of goes into three areas, which is interest, education, and implementation. And I will go through all of those. The first slide is intentionally quite blank because it's Ingrid, and she's the force behind what got the program started in Dunkirk. And I'm hoping that some of you maybe on this webinar are interested and can picture yourself, because it's a blank slide. So instead you can picture yourself as Ingrid. I gave her a call yesterday and asked her how she kind of got started and what got her interested. Ingrid lives close to Stoughton, and she, as she called it, she lives on the edge of Stoughton, and she got involved in land use with a Walmart that was coming into town that was quite controversial. And then a few years passed after the Walmart was actually put in. They lost that battle, and she was just thinking about and worried that development would take over her area, and that in general the town would disappear. So Ingrid got active. She says she did her homework. And she found out about purchase of development rights programs, and she went to the town board and asked them to consider something to protect farmland. So I guess my first message is just share your interest if you have it, and volunteer to help. And Ingrid also volunteered to help in any way that she could, and her going to the town board really got things moving. They started to think about it, and then because of her interest and her just asking the questions and engaging the town board, at some point I came across their path, and they found out the work that I had done, and so I was invited to speak to the town board, and I did almost the whole previous webinar in just telling them about how purchase of development rights programs work and what the pros and cons are, and about other programs in the state of Wisconsin. And so that initial being invited in, which was inspired by Ingrid, got the town board to think about it some more, and they decided to form a subcommittee to evaluate the possibilities and talk to residents. And that was just done in 2016. And so that was kind of the first step, is just sharing your interest, getting something going. And then the subcommittee started work on evaluation, messaging, and details. So the subcommittee had a local farmer, a plan commissioner, some longtime residents, some newer residents, and Ingrid, of course. Ingrid actually falls into the category of a newer resident. She moved to Stoughton in 2006, and I just think that's important because some people think that they need to be a local politician, or they need to be a planner or an attorney or a high-powered something, or a longtime resident, and that's just not true. I think that anybody can share their interest and be inspirational and try and get a program started. And so the big task of working with the subcommittee was getting them educated. Again, going through just everything about what a PDR program is, and sharing that with the subcommittee. Because they end up being your ambassadors and the people that are going out there and talking to others. So we spent quite a bit of time educating them, and then also looked at other programs. They were charged with evaluation, and is purchase of development rights what they wanted to do? Maybe they wanted to transfer development rights, so we brought in other speakers and things like that. And in the end, they decided that purchase of development rights was the right option for the town of Dunkirk. As part of that evaluation process, they looked at other data. I don't know what other states are like, but in Wisconsin, we have to have comprehensive plans. Local communities have to have comprehensive plans, and part of that process usually starts with a community survey. And so we took a look at that. That was done in 2004, so we're in 2016, 2017 at this point. So this is old data, but still very good data. And 90% of the people at that time agreed that the town should work to maintain its rural character, and it just gave even more of a mandate for the work that this committee was doing. We also spent a lot of time talking about messaging and how we wanted to talk to the community about this once we decided that purchase of development rights was something that we wanted to do. You can spend time talking about what you're fighting against, which in this case could have been perceived as the city of Stoughton and their annexation into the town of Dunkirk. And we could have also looked at Dunkirk's dwindling land. This slide here shows just how the land base is eroding in Dunkirk. Some of it's coming out of agriculture, some of it's going into annexation, but we decided that that wasn't what we wanted our message to be. So instead, we talked about what we were fighting for, not what we were fighting against, and we tried to keep our message really positive. We emphasized regional food security. We emphasized providing options for farmers, a way to get capital, and more investment for farming, a way to do estate planning. We emphasized rural preservation, open space preservation, and those kind of things, and just really talked about what we wanted for Stoughton and tried to have a very positive message. We also did quite a few community forums as a way of educating people. We sent postcards. I love the fact that I have one here that still has a stamp on it that didn't go out. Again, this is where volunteers came in. They designed the postcards. They put the stamps on the postcards, addresses on the postcards. And so we had 4 community meetings where we talked about the purchase of development rights, and we had those over, I think, a 2-year period. We were very conscious and spent a lot of time planning those community forums. So a postcard went out to every residence in the town. We tried to get local speakers to come in, local farmers, and we're just there's a lot of conservation activity going on in Dane County, so that really helped. We could get local speakers that were just from a town to the north in the town of Dunn. And we also had people in the audience when we were speaking, because this is, it can be a very controversial topic. We had to have the town constable there. People get very passionate about land use, and they get very passionate about farming and development. So we had some audience members there that were also had served on other land trusts or other purchase of development rights programs. So sometimes when you might have an unruly, hard to facilitate person in your audience, having another audience member speak to them can sometimes be better than a speaker. So we had planted people, I think you might say, and local speakers, and just the combination worked really well for us. We also did a survey that was mailed to every residence. We had a 26.5% return rate, which we're kind of proud of in survey world. That's a pretty good return rate. And we just asked people about farmland preservation and whether they were willing to increase their taxes to fund a program. And overwhelmingly, the answer was yes. And then details. So I'd like to spend a little time on this because I think this is quite important. Like I said before, I had experience running a PDR program, but not starting one. So I went out and talked to some local politicians and people that had done other successful conservation campaigns. And what I heard over and over again was details. Give them all the details. Don't keep anybody guessing on anything. So here we have just all the work that this committee did so that we would have all of the paperwork. We had it all on a website and we had our mission statement, we had our goals, we had our strategies, we had our ordinance that was 99% done. We realized that we needed the town of Dunkirk, like I said, has about in the 2,000 for population. So the town of Dunkirk has a part-time clerk, and that part-time clerk could not take on running this program. So we had a memorandum of understanding with our local land trust that detailed everything and how everything would pan out, from who ordered the appraisal to how the monitoring would be done. And all of these documents were on our website. And it was interesting at the meetings that we had. By the nature of the questions, we can tell that people went and looked at this information. We had our ranking criteria that Janice just talked about, all lined out and ready to go based on soils and the size of the farm and number of building sites. We had information on how commissioners, because we were going to have a different group of people, not the study committee, but appointed commissioners from the town board that were going to run the program, how they would be appointed, what types of people we were looking for that. We talked about other programs. We had a lot of this information came from AFT, frequently asked questions, pros and cons, all of that. So just we paid a lot of attention to the details before we went to referendum. And we spent a lot of time. I think it's important for people to know that there are other successful programs, and we spent quite a bit of time talking about other successful programs in Wisconsin. Here we have the map is the town of Dunn to the north, the program that I used to run. Everything in blue is protected, so quite a bit of land, and everything in blue is protected with a conservation easement. All the other colors are different kinds of land protection in the town. So quite an accomplishment there. We spent quite a bit of time trying to decide whether or not you talk about money. And this is something that there's differing philosophies on. When I got online, a lot of it said that don't talk about money at all. And we decided to go with, we're giving everybody every detail we possibly can so they can evaluate this program. So we did talk about the money. We talk about transaction costs, which can range between $15,000 and $18,000 a deal, and is seen as, I'd put it in the con category of a program, but we talked about it and we're right out there with that. We talked about municipal tax rates. There's a big difference between being in the town of Dunkirk and the city of Stoughton. This is a slide from American Farmland Trust. We talked about the cost of community services, kind of that cows don't call 911 or go to school, and this, programs can help keep your taxes down. We talked about how expensive the development rights could be based on other sales in Dane County. We talked about the equalized value or the wealth of property in Dunkirk, and very specifically what a tax could possibly bring in. We set it at 50 cents per thousand equalized valuation, which doesn't bring in much. It would only bring in a little over $100,000 a year. And what we could possibly do with that money as a way to get started. We talked about outside funding that Janice just talked about, and there was nothing on the table at the time when Dunkirk started talking about this. We used to have state programs, we used to have county programs, all of that had dried up. There was nothing on the table at the federal level at the time, but we also talked about how doing nothing wasn't really working for Stoughton either, and so their citizens decided to give it a try. And as Janice said, if you start something, the funding will come, and it did in our case. And the final step for us was implementation. We've done all of this education, outreach. I don't know if I talked about it before, but Ingrid would sit down with people and have coffee, and she'd say, I don't know if I changed how they would vote, but they felt heard. And we had people knocking on doors, and we decided, we went to a referendum. It took us several years to get to this point, but the town board decided to do a non-binding referendum. And the reason that they decided to do that was because they really wanted a mandate for a program, and they didn't want to have a program if it won by 1 or 2 votes or even 10 votes or just a few percentage points. They didn't want to be forced into having a program, so they went with a non-binding referendum. It was quite successful. We had 62% of the vote in favor of raising their taxes to run a program. And that's where we were in 2019 when kind of the pandemic hit. And that put us on pause for a while. I think that happened to a lot of people just trying to figure out what to do. Meetings weren't happening. We needed to appoint a new commission. People weren't really quite comfortable with that at that point. Like I said, these things can be controversial, and so someone ran against our town chair in the next election, basically that was opposed to purchase of development rights program, and so they wanted to see how that would play out. That person only got 24% of the vote, so again, it took some time for them after the referendum. It wasn't immediately running to start a program. What really helped us was that in 2021, there was new federal funding through NRCS because we had a program that was, it was voted on. It hadn't actually started yet, but there was a lot of hope. And our land trust put our name forward to help get some of the funding from NRCS, and we now have a $400,000 allocation that we're trying to use. And so that really just that funding and that opportunity, because we had a program, got us moving again after a pause. And we started meeting twice a month to kind of make up for that almost 2 years, year and a half that they had done nothing. And so the town board appointed a Rural Preservation Commission, so a new commission. At this point, actually, Ingrid had moved out of the town, so we had to move on without her. And so I had a whole new commission to educate, so we started doing that again. We adopted an ordinance that had been 99% done by the previous study committee. We finished the ranking criteria. We We sent letters directly to every landowner with 35 acres or more in the town. Got 12 applications. We would have been happy with 3 or 4. We were incredibly happy with 12 applications. We processed them. We have the funding that we're trying to use from NRCS. In the process, we found more funding for a wetland easement that we're working on. And the town board has approved 3 applications that we're currently in negotiations with. So this is my group here. And that's my story, I guess.
Thanks so much, Renee. I really appreciate you sharing your experience and your story. It's really clear how important education is and learning from folks as you're talking about these programs. We do have a question, an interesting question. In your experience, what arguments against a PDR program or a program like this resonate the most across political spectrums that you've found?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's the money. That's a really big argument, that these programs are expensive, and they take a lot of time and they take a lot of administration, and those are the kind of things that I hear.
So you talked about how the folks that your original kind of committee of volunteers that were formed briefly considered transfer of development rights. How did the group of folks make the decision to move from transfer of development rights to promote permanent conservation of agricultural lands through these easement programs? I'm curious about how that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That took quite some time for us. And I think one of the things is that transferring development rights is a lot more complicated, and they just wanted to get started and to do something. And I can tell you that the transfer of development rights has not gone away. It is still something that the town is looking at. And just like last month, they appointed a committee to look into that as another option. So I think that was almost a more temporary decision to just kind of get started and get moving.
More questions coming in, Renee. One person asking for your contact information. I have provided that to them. Next question is, how do you, and this is something I was thinking about as well, is how do you keep the commission from becoming a division of the planning department?
Well, there's no departments in Dunkirk, so that's pretty easy. Like I said, they have a part-time clerk. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a bunch of volunteers, just some really dedicated people. There's a farmer that doesn't, barely has time to make it to the meetings because farming is a very demanding lifestyle, but he's quite dedicated and comes. We have some long-term residents. We have one person from the Plan Commission. That's kind of that carryover. The town board is so interested in this; they come to every single meeting. But yeah, we don't have a planning department, and we've had to contract out for our GIS work, which is our geographic information services, our mapping and things like that. So that's just not going to happen in Dunkirk. But I love that question.
And the next question is, so the scenario is there's been a little bit of engagement around farmland protection and why it would be beneficial in this community. There's been enough interest at the county level to where there's been an invitation to attend the Environmental and Land Use Commission meeting to make a presentation. But this is the first of hopefully many conversations. How would you recommend approaching that conversation? Would you jump right into talking about PDR programs and why they would be beneficial for the community, or would you start maybe smaller and kind of build that initial education piece first?
Yeah, we decided to focus on success stories. So we looked at other programs and talked about what they were doing and talked about their success. We also talked about the fact that we need to bring some of this land preservation money to Wisconsin and bring it in locally. I mean, everybody pays federal taxes, and to be able to have those resources come back into our town and do things that we, land preservation and rural preservation and things that we're talking about anyway, just really made a lot of sense.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Renee. Maybe we'll have more questions for you at the end, but I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks.
So next, I will introduce our final panelist, Barry Lonick. Barry is the president of Treemore Ecology and Land Services, where he consults with nonprofits, local governments, private landowners, and conservation buyers toward the protection of natural and agricultural lands. He has led the effort to establish the model farmland and natural area protection programs in Washtenaw County, some of the most successful in Michigan, for 31 years, and has been involved with 11 ballot campaigns, 10 of which won, that will raise over $190 million for the acquisition of land and conservation easements. Through Barry's direct involvement, over 8,300 acres of land have been permanently protected in and around Washtenaw County, Michigan, and he's attracted over $21 million of state and federal matching grants for farmland protection. Welcome, Barry.
I want to talk about the examples of successful programs in Washtenaw County, Michigan, which is just west of Wayne County, which is the location of the city of Detroit, the biggest city in Michigan, of course. So we are very fortunate to have a number of publicly funded programs here in Washtenaw County. We have a countywide program called the Natural Area Preservation Program that has a natural area preservation component and a farmland component. We have the City of Ann Arbor's Greenbelt program, which extends out into the surrounding landscapes. There are 3 townships nearby to the City of Ann Arbor that all have dedicated millages for this purpose also. Those are the ones that I am currently staffing. And then over in the southeast corner of the county is a small rural township called Augusta, that has a very small millage. Of the 9 publicly funded programs for land preservation in the state of Michigan, 6 of them are located here in Washtenaw County. And for those of you who don't know Washtenaw County, it is the home to the city of Ann Arbor, which is frequently cited as the one of the top 3 places in the country to live. And it's also home to the University of Michigan, which is often cited as one of the top 3 public universities in the country. And because of those things, and also a strong public school system, a couple of major freeways that cross the area, we are and have been facing with sprawl development around Ann Arbor for many years now. In Michigan, we have township government, where local units have planning and zoning authority, and there's no requirement for there being any coordination between those units of government. So one township can decide that they want to develop everything that they've got, and an adjacent township can decide that they want to preserve everything that they've got. And there's no requirement for them to coordinate their activities, nor with any of the cities that are located within the county as well. So going back to the mid-90s, there were a number of folks, including myself, who were concerned about the kind of sprawl development that we were seeing and the loss of farmland and natural areas in our countryside. We explored a number of options that could be implemented to curb that, including things like cluster developments and agricultural zoning, and recognize that neither one of those or other things that we considered were really going to have any impact on conserving land in the area, and settled on doing a purchase of development rights or PACE program to achieve that. In 1996, we made a pitch to our county board of commissioners, and even though they don't have planning and zoning authority, they do have taxing authority. And we thought, let's go for a countywide millage and see if we can generate some funds to do that. not having that planning and zoning authority, the county board was a little bit surprised to hear from us, to say the least. They did think that there was a merit to the argument that we were making, and so they formed a task force of a variety of people. I think there were probably 40 or something people that were on that task force, and met over the course of almost a year and a half, and ultimately produced a report with a set of recommendations. And from that report came our first ballot proposal, which was in 1998. It was countywide, and it was for 10 years, 4/10 of a mil, and would have generated about $40 million if it had been passed. And there were 4 recommendations in that county task force report. One of them was for a millage for farmland preservation through purchasing development rights. One of them was a separate millage for the purchase of natural areas for nature preserves. The third recommendation was for brownfield redevelopment opportunities in our urban areas. And a fourth was better planning and technical assistance for the more rural townships in our county. The County Board of Commissioners, in their infinite wisdom, decided to combine all 4 of those recommendations into one ballot proposal, which voters did find to be confusing. And nevertheless, we got on the ballot. We had an enormous amount of media coverage. This is back when we had a daily newspaper here in the Ann Arbor area. And we were on the radio, we were in print. There was a lot of coverage. So that one of the upsides of that experience was that we did an extensive job of educating the public about the issues and about what land preservation is about, and particularly what buying development rights on properties is all about. Unfortunately, we lost that campaign. We had a professional poll done by a national firm in August of that year, a couple of months ahead of the November election. We had 50% of those people that were surveyed said they were in support of the proposal, and another 20% that said they were leaning toward supporting the proposal. And so the advice that we had from some national experts that we engaged in that process was to run what we call the SAFE campaign, just sort of bring that message home, and that there was a high likelihood of success. So we went from 70% or so of likely or for sure voting yes at that time. What we knew was going to happen was that the local Home Builders Association and the local realtors, the Board of Realtors, were going to oppose this proposal. They were able to tap into the local Home Builders Association coffers, as well as the state association and the national association, and got huge checks from each one of those, as well as the Board of Realtors. And so they amassed very quickly and very easily $330,000 to help defeat this proposal. They hired a very effective campaign manager who was a real bulldog, and ran what we call a green scam campaign, where they appeared to be the good guys. They did not come out and say, we're the home builders and the developers and we oppose this. Their message was there's a better way to do this, that they were not unsupportive of preserving land, but this tax was not the best way to do that. They never said what the better way was, of course, but nevertheless, that was their message, and that resonated with voters. Because they had such a large amount of funding available to them, they were able to use much more effectively a mass market presentation of their arguments using television, in particular cable television, whereas we were, hauling in checks in $20 and $30 amounts, and using a door-to-door campaign, doing mailings, but that was not the strategy that we carried that day. And unfortunately, we lost that election by a pretty substantial margin, 58 to 42. So we went from 70% support in just a couple of months' time to 58 or 42% support. We did a post-election poll and asked people a number of things, including, did you know who funded the opposition? And the vast majority of them did not know. And we asked them, would that have changed their opinion had they known that, and a lot of them said it would have. So the two places in the Washtenaw County that that the voters approved or supported that proposal was the city of Ann Arbor, and then just north of the city of Ann Arbor in Ann Arbor Township. So we kept that in mind going forward. All the other townships and cities within Washtenaw County, there were more no votes than yes votes for that proposal. But that didn't stop us. We were dedicated to what we were doing. And the very next year in the city of Ann Arbor, we carried petitions around and succeeded in getting on the ballot for an extension of a natural area preservation millage within the city limits, a 5-year millage that had been in effect for some time. And that passed with no opposition, with 65% support. The next year we came back again, recognizing that in the 1998 proposal, the home builders and realtors said that they were opposed to the farmland preservation component of that proposal, but not to the natural area preservation part of it. And so we just picked that piece of it out and went back to the County Board of Commissioners and asked them to put that on the ballot, and they agreed. We ran that campaign with no opposition as well, and won that one with 64% countywide vote for a 10-year levy, a new levy for $0.25 mil. And that was to generate about $30 million for the purchase of natural areas as nature preserves in Washtenaw County. We still didn't stop there though, because farmland preservation was still not being accomplished through that 2000 ballot proposal countywide. And so with support from the mayor of Ann Arbor at that time, we went forth with a Parks and Greenbelt proposal in the city of Ann Arbor. It was an extension of that 1999 millage that we got passed. But this time it was for 30 years, not for 5 years. And instead of just buying parkland within the city of Ann Arbor limits, we expanded the ability of those funds to be used 1/3 for continuing to buy parkland within the city, but then 2/3 of it to be spent outside of the city in what we call the Greenbelt zone. And there's an original depiction there in this slide of where that was located. We've expanded that a couple of miles to the east and west since then, but basically that's the area around Ann Arbor that has a lot of green space in it, and pitched to the voters that you like Ann Arbor, right? You'd like to be able to drive out or ride your bike out into the countryside and not see housing developments everywhere. We want to keep it that way. And with that kind of an argument, we won with about 67% of the vote. There was opposition from the Home Builders Association in that campaign. We had convinced the realtors to stay out of it at that point by going to them and saying, look, what are you trying to sell out there? You're trying to sell quality of life. You're trying to sell rural character in the countryside. That's what's getting you big house values. And they eventually said, you're right about that. And they stayed out of the picture. And so it was just the home builders alone in that case in 2003. And we anticipated that would be the case. And we're prepared with our own television ads at that point to call them out to say, it's the developers that are funding the opposition to this campaign, and you all hate the developers, don't you? And people said, yes, we do hate the developers. And so we won with 2/3 of the people voting that day. The same day we had a proposal on the ballot in Ann Arbor Township, just north of the city, 0.7 mil for a 20-year millage to preserve land through buying development rights. And that won with nearly 80% of the vote. The following year, the township immediately west of the city of Ann Arbor, Scioto, put its first proposal on the ballot for $0.5 mil, 10 years, $6 million, passed with 75% support. The following year, Webster Township, which is more rural and northwest of the city of Ann Arbor, put its first proposal on the ballot for $0.5 mil, 5 years. That passed with 70% support, generated just shy of $1 million. Since then, a number of those municipalities have put renewals on the ballot, and they've all won. You can see with the percentages that they've won by. In addition, the county millage was renewed in 2010. and we were able to convince the Board of Commissioners to amend the county ordinance to specify that farmland is a natural resource, and so 25% of the funds starting in 2010 could be used for farmland easements, 75% still going for the natural area part of the program. That millage, the county millage, was renewed again just a couple of years ago with, again, a huge amount of support. SIO is back on the ballot this November for a renewal, and now we have 2 new townships, including Dexter, where I live, and that are on the ballot this November as well for their first time at getting funding for these programs. So here's a map of what Washtenaw County looked like in 2000, before all these programs came online. We have in the northwest corner there a couple of state recreation areas similar to state parks. There's some parkland along the Huron River that flows through the county and through the cities of Ypsilanti and Ann Arbor. There's some state game areas. There's some land conservancy activity. That was what was going on as of 22 years ago. Here's the slide of what it looks like now. As a result of all these programs having been online, this is from 2019 actually, so we've added to that just in the last 3 years as well. I'm going to skip back and forth a couple of times just to see, so you can see what the impact has been. So again, here's 2000. Here's 2019. Ann Arbor Township just north of the city, Scioto west of the city, Webster northwest of the city, and then other activity throughout the county through these programs that have been in place now for nearly 20 years. Oop, there we go. So how do you get on the ballot? In Michigan, the only way to get on the ballot, if you're not in a city where a city has a charter, and the charter allows for citizens to collect signatures and force an issue onto the ballot, a citizen initiative, is by referendum. So you have to go to your local, contact your local officials, whether that's at the county level or at the township level, or I suppose it happens at a village level too, possibly, and say we want to put this proposal before our voters and let them decide whether they want to tax themselves for this purpose. And hopefully you can find a champion on your local board, whether it's a county or a township, that will take the lead on that. Sometimes you can. If they are reluctant or you don't have somebody like that, then you can do things to rally citizen support for that. And I would encourage you to include farmers in that. And we do have a number of farmers from the get-go who understood what this was all about. We're supportive of that. We were able to use those folks to make the arguments in front of the county board initially, and also the township board in more recent years. I would also suggest that having some citizen pressure on your local elected officials would be helpful through calls and emails, of course, making public statements at meetings. We also, on a couple of occasions, drafted non-binding petitions that we went door to door with and got signatures on, and presented those to our township board, just to show that there was interest and support in these kinds of programs, and to put something on the ballot. In my home township of Dexter Township, we did not get anywhere with those elected officials for a number of years and a number of attempts. And so in 2020, we ran a slate of 7 women for Board of Trustees, and 6 of them won. And those were all folks that were adamantly supportive of farmland preservation and land preservation in general. And so if you don't get what you want, you vote them out. And in terms of when is the best time to run one of these campaigns, the wisdom that I heard from the get-go, and I haven't heard anything to change that, is that the more people who turn out for an election, the better chances you have to win. So the best time to run it is in the November election of our presidential year. It was I remember, going back 20 some years, that the national experts said there were people who just showed up for the presidential election and no other election, no school boards, no governor, no US senator. They didn't show up for anything else but to vote for in the presidential election. And that they were oftentimes people who supported these kinds of measures as well. we'll get a good turnout this coming November. That's why we chose to go on the ballot in Dexter and Northfield townships. But that's one of my pieces of advice also, is that the more voters you get, the more likely you are to succeed with these things, and not to do it at a time when it's a standalone issue on the ballot, or if it's just a school board election, or there's this one other thing when you're only going to get 8 or 10% of the electorate to show up. You want 70, 80, 90% of the electorate to show up. You have a better chance to win. In terms of running a campaign, you need some money. You may not need a lot of money, maybe just a few $1,000s for a local township kind of campaign. But we've drafted a fundraising letter that we've sent out to our friends and neighbors here in Dexter Township. We use for the first time a QR code, which is now not only on our fundraising letter, but also on our yard signs as well. So people can scan the QR code and make a contribution directly to the campaign that way. And you pick up the phone and call people and ask them to contribute. It might be $50 or $100, but that makes the difference in a campaign, especially in a small scale at a township level. With those funds, we're buying yard signs. We're doing at least one mailing to all registered voters. We've created a pretty rudimentary but effective website. And we've held a couple of events just to educate the population about what this proposal is about and what it would do. If you have more time and more interest, you can certainly go door to door. That's very effective at informing the population about it. You can do phone banks. That's also very effective, but it does take more time and energy to do. Sometimes people do door hangers. You've got the funds. You can do radio and print ads. Certainly getting free pub in the newspapers is very helpful as well. Also very important to have folks at the polling sites on election day and ahead of time to let people know that they can get a ride or whatever. We do have a lot of people still voting absentee these days, so that is increasing the speed with which we are endeavoring to communicate with people. Absentee ballots are going to go out here sometime in the next week or so, and so our first mailing is going to be timed to coincide with that. The Huron River Watershed Council, which is local here to Washtenaw County, has a great toolkit that's available on their website for free download. So that's addresses there for you. And then if you want to take a quick look at the Dexter Township campaign website, that's listed there as well. In terms of arguments for these kinds of programs supporting agriculture, if you've got fresh food production, you've got an apple orchard down the road from me, for example, they're big supporters of this program. We want to conserve those kinds of lands so we have access to fresh food. Those are great arguments to make. Maintaining your rural landscapes, protecting water quality, habitat, scenic views, all those kinds of things. And more importantly these days, being able to store carbon either in trees or in the soil, I think is resonating with voters. But also I would highly recommend having some economic arguments in your holster, if you will. Renee mentioned the American Farmland Trust having pioneered the cost of community services studies many years ago. We did one of those here in Scioto Township to show that farmland and open space properties pay more than they require in services, and that residential properties cost more than they pay in services. And that's primarily because schools are expensive. I've certainly heard the argument here locally that it's another tax, that we're trying to get from people. And this is, they're tough times, inflation's high. It's $500,000 that we're asking for here in Dexter Township this year. I pulled out my winter tax bill from last year just to see what the school cost is. We've had a lot of development here in this area. We're a little further west of Ann Arbor, but still not far. And the new schools have been built a couple of times over the last 20 years or so. On my tax bill is to pay for those schools and some other things, technology improvements and other stuff, but that cost is $8.5 million. And I communicated with folks at the Dexter Community Schools just yesterday, actually, and confirmed that about half of that was to build a new elementary school. The previous bond was to build a new high school and do some other things there. So we're basically paying $4 million plus to construct new schools. And if we're able to conserve farmland by passing these millages and not having to subsidize development going forward, then it's a long-term cost savings, and I can bear that out by just what's on my winter tax bill. And what I like to say is, what is it that you want to pay for? Because taxes, like death, aren't going to go away, and they're inevitable. So what do you want to pay for? How much do you want to pay? And how long do you want to pay for it? If you're buying new schools because of new subdivisions going into the community, then you're going to pay a lot more, and those are usually paid for with 30-year bonds. And we're asking for $500,000 that we can match with lots of other county, state, federal, private sources, and conserve a lot of land so we avoid new subdivisions. And the other thing that I often say to people is, and Renee, sort of same picture, if you got nothing, chances are you're going to get nothing. But if you got something, you're going to get something. Webster Township that I mentioned has now had a millage since 2005, so about 17 years. Their millage generates about $190,000 a year. Not much money. And when development rights are, $5,000, $7,000, $8,000, $10,000 an acre, doesn't get you very far. But we're able to leverage those local dollars with $5 from somewhere else, those other sources that I mentioned, and able to conserve. I think we're over 2,500 acres now in Webster Township, for that millage. So if you got something, chances are you're going to get more. When you win, make sure you got that ordinance on the books with some sort of means of deciding which properties you're going to go for. It might be a scoring system, might be some qualitative system, but you got to have a means of being able to differentiate between properties. You got to have an advisory committee of local residents, including a farmer, ideally. You got to figure out how you're going to do about staffing, and you got to know who you're dealing with for the various services that you need: survey, appraisal, environmental assessment, and an attorney that knows what they're doing. And I think we open up for questions for everybody at this point, right?
That's right. We do have one question for you, Barry. Can you explain a millage, or what a mill is?
Yes, a millage is a property tax. It may have other terms in other locations, but basically a tax that people pay. Here in Michigan, it's based on we call it the taxable value of your property. And it's $1 for every $1,000 of property value, if I remember that correctly. So my property here has a taxable value of about $90,000. And this is a house that I own on a couple of acres of land. And so a half a mill tax would cost me about $45.
Perfect. Thank you. So we would love to invite all of our panelists to join us back now as we take a few final questions from our attendees. We did have, if I can find the question dialog box, here it is, a question in the beginning for Janice. The question was, how many acres of farmland were protected through your program, and did you prioritize applicants by conservation management practices? Janice, I think your microphone's breaking up.
Participating in NRCS programs in 2002 for the first year.
Can you say that again, Janice? I think we only heard the end of your answer.
Oh, sure. I said that we have about 6,200 acres. We're in process always, so those numbers add up. Protected, we started in 2001. We started participation in federal match in 2002.
Perfect. We have a question for you, Renee. And the question is, any tips on keeping your volunteers motivated and engaged over a long process? I think specifically thinking about how you had to take a pause over a couple years of the pandemic.
Yeah, so let's see. We had a new group that came after the pandemic, but I think that just really respecting people, valuing their opinions, letting them know why they're there, what each person brings to the table, having very well organized, well-run meetings, really using their time well, and then asking things from them. You know, we had people drafting letters and doing different things, and we had people helping with our ranking criteria. And so I think it's just really using their time well and making sure they know their value and they're appreciated.
Great, thank you. This is a question for everyone. Has the state government had a role in any of these programs? If so, who? And if not, what are the reasons?
Well, I can start on that. We had a state program, and there's just nothing on the books at all right now. Well, there might be something on the books, but there's zero funding in it. So yeah, just change of politics, I guess, is the reason in Wisconsin.
Yes.
This is Janice. We do not have a state program in Illinois, which is unfortunate, and I'm glad we did not wait for a state program. And that was, you know, one of the comments that I often hear is that, well, we have to wait for state authorization. Well, if we had done that, we would be waiting 22 years and not have. So that's an encouragement, I think, what you'll hear from all of us in terms of the benefits of local programming and local control. You know, that's one thing you have. Now, the nice addition that we have.
I think your microphone's breaking up again, Janice.
Well, I'll jump in and say that there was a funding source in Michigan for a number of years, 20 years ago or so. That also dried up. But just in the last 3 years or so, that funding source has come back online and is appearing to be stable. And so we've been able to tap into that in all the communities where I work. But similarly, you know, we didn't want to rely on that when we started these programs 20 years ago, and recognized that if we were going to get anything done, it had to be at least start with our local programs, and we succeeded.
Perfect. This is a question from a farmer that wants to put an easement on their land. How does a PACE program impact them directly, and to what extent?
Well, they get a nice cash payment. That's an impact. Sometimes there is a reduction in the assessment on the property for property tax purposes. They got varies from state to state, and in Michigan, it depends a lot on what the assessment is now. We don't have the ability, like I know some states out east have, to reduce the assessments down to almost nothing, which is what it should be, frankly, if somebody permanently restricts the use of their land. But there are instances where the assessments are higher than what the appraiser or the local assessor says is the value of the property. And there have been instances where the assessments have been reduced, and hence the property taxes have been reduced.
In Wisconsin, we have use value, so we don't have any property tax impact at all, and that's one of the things that's really interesting how different we are, that we tout, because you know, these lands are protected and they're still bringing in the same amount of tax revenue. I think a local program can really, you just need a program. So, you know, some places have active land trusts that will help you. But I think, as Barry said, it's helping to get funding and helping you to get some value out of your conservation easement, instead of having to make it be a complete donation.
The other thing I would say is that there are many folks who are taking the proceeds from the sale of a conservation easement and doing what we call a 1031 exchange. That's the section of the Internal Revenue Code. And for every dollar that you use for that, you're not subject to capital gains tax. And so there are people who are able to, buy land that they've been renting that could be lost to them if somebody decides they're going to sell it off for development or something happens. So they've been able to solidify their operation by using that 1031 option.
I'll add something in here too that we found in Kane County over 20, and that is that what ends up happening, we had an unwanted major highway proposed through our agriculture corridor, and it didn't go through because of protected farms. And of course now the funding for that is long gone for that highway. And you have the surety that you're going to have a concentration of agriculture that's there in perpetuity. I think it's critical to understand that the threat that farms are so often under for infrastructure expansion, unnecessary infrastructure expansion.
Yeah, that's a great point, Angie. We've seen that around here too, where when we started these programs, people said, there's no future for agriculture. Why are we even bothering with this? And that is long gone. People see a future now for agriculture, whether it's larger scale, commodity crop production, or we're seeing more and more land being transferred into the hands of a younger generation of farmers, many of whom are growing vegetables and animals for local markets. And so that never comes up anymore. And that was prevalent, 20, 25 years ago.
Great, thank you. That was Janice that was responding. I think her camera's just off, but I appreciate all of your insight. So it's time to wrap up. We are at the end of our 90 minutes. I just want to say thank you again to our wonderful panelists for a great conversation today. And again, thank you all for joining us to learn more about farmland protection and purchase of agricultural conservation easement programs. All registrants will receive a recording of today's webinar via email, as well as an invitation to join American Farmland Trust National Agricultural Land Network, which is a community of practitioners engaged in agricultural land protection, gives you access to a network of peers to ask questions and troubleshoot and things that you're working on in your communities. Finally, as we close up today, I ask that you please complete the exit survey that you will receive at the completion of today's webinar. And that's all we have for today. So thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.